Good evening, everybody. Professor Dorian Fuller is here to present on this particular topic, which is domestication and agricultural origins in Southwest Asia and South Asia. He is now a professor of archaeobotany, but when he first came to India, he was just 23-year-old young researcher in 1997, and that was the turning point for both of us. He started his PhD research and I started taking interest in the Neolithic archaeology of this particular region, and that has ushered in a series of publications which has definitely transformed our understanding of origins of agriculture in southern India in particular, and also placing these findings against the global background was another exciting opportunity that we all had. And since then, he has developed to such an extent. He is now an acclaimed authority on the archaeobotany, especially origins of agricultural economies in different parts of Asia, Southwest Asia, Southern Asia, Eastern Asia, and several parts of Africa and so on. And you will not be surprised to know his productivity is so high. He has published nearly 450 research papers and has been regarded as perhaps the most original thinker in the area of agricultural origins and so on. I met him for the first time in 1996 when I was an Ancient India Charles Wiley's Fellow at Cambridge. I was affiliated to the Department of Archaeology, and his professor was Martin Jones, another well-known archaeobotanist of the time, and also another Indian professor by name Dilip Chakravarti, who is familiar to many of you. He was his co-guide, and at that time he was doing his MPhil on origins of agricultural economies in southern Neolithic and so on. And that particular point of time, our interaction led to identifying a problem relating to the southern Indian Neolithic culture. In fact, in Indian archaeology, southern Indian Neolithic archaeology has occupied a very, very prominent place, and it has the longest research that has been known to have happened in Indian archaeology. And a series of sites were excavated in the post-independence and a decade prior to the declaration of independence. But pioneering archaeologists had played an important role in finding potential sites and also making a clear description of the nature of agricultural early Neolithic sites. And those days, Neolithic was defined only on the basis of stone tools, pottery types, and then the settlements associated with hilltops and also ash mounds and things like that. Several eminent archaeologists had worked on several of these sites. Many sites were excavated both by British archaeologists as well as archaeologists representing the Archeological Survey of India. We knew a lot about the material culture. We knew something about the animals which were recovered from excavations and their identification in terms of domesticated sheep, goat, cattle and so on. And then there was no information about the food grains or food crops that were cultivated. Neolithic people were the first agriculturists anywhere in the world. The agriculture involved both domestication of plants as well as animals, so that we all know. So in this case, there were gaps in our knowledge of the economy, subsistence economy of these people, whether they were pure pastoralists, whether they were, agro-pastoralists, or they were, not having access to fertile landscapes, to be able to initiate cultivation and things like that. And then it was generally believed that agriculture in this part of southern India was a late starter, and it was the result of introduction of food crops from further north in the Deccan and then further northwest in the Indus province and so on. But his work, proved that this understanding of the Neolithic was a myth, and then we decided to work together. We knew large number of sites, and we had several thousand sites of the later prehistoric period, and at least 50 sites were excavated by 1990s and so on. And further north of this area, the Western Deccan region had also produced excellent results in terms of archaeobotanical findings and so on. And there were gaps here. Although the Neolithic of this region had laid the foundations for Neolithic agricultural way of life, but the North Deccan sites had produced excellent results about various types of plant foods that were cultivated by the Chalcolithic people and so on. So there was this particular gap which required an attention, and he was the right person to take up the issue for a doctoral research, and that is where Dr. Martin Jones, Dr. Dilip Chakravarti and myself, we agreed to help him come and visit these sites, select sites, and do archaeobotanical research, and that is where it took off. And then at the end of his PhD program, he came out with a definite model that agricultural origins in this part of southern India is independent of any kind of influence or stimulus from outside. And that he established the fact that before the food crops like cereals, wheat and barley were introduced into this area, local millets were the first food crops, were harvested, then cultivated, and then the domesticated forms are developed and so on. So this was an economy based on domestication of sheep, goat, and the cattle, the jebu, the Indian bull. And in addition to this, the early phase of the Neolithic was also characterized by the adoption of local millets, small millets they are called, as opposed to jowar and ragi, which are large millets, and they are also not native to this area. So several of these new insights were obtained through his doctoral research, and that gave him a big push, and he has traveled across the world, he has contributed to very, very seminal papers, and we regard him as an authority on the archaeobotany. And we are all privileged, and I feel extremely happy that what research he carried out nearly 30 years ago still remains valid. Nobody has been able to contradict and produce contradictory results and so on. And then he will place his findings against the background of the hotspot of agricultural origins, that is Southwestern Asia. And I would not like to stand between you and him for long. I welcome Professor Dorian Fuller to present his paper. Thank you.
Catch it?
You feel it?
Okay. Okay, hopefully you can hear me okay. It's a little bit echoey, but there we are. Okay, so thank you so much for that introduction. I'm very pleased to be here at this museum to present this work. And as the title indicates, what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through our current understanding of plant domestication and early agriculture in Southwest Asia, so what Europeans often call the Near East. And then we're going to look at South India so we can see some of the similarities and differences in terms of our understanding and in terms of our available data sets. But first, it's worth taking a step back and thinking about how momentous the origins of agriculture was. So when we look around the world today, whether it's in Indonesia, these rice terraces, or these fields and olive groves in Morocco, or the landscape you see when you drive outside of Ballari, much of the landscape is transformed by agricultural practices and agricultural processes and agricultural cycles. So in some sense, much of the Earth's surface is an artifact, but that's a relatively recent development. So if you walk around the ground floor of this museum, you have millions of years of human evolution and cognitive and technological evolution of stone tools. All of those people gathered wild foods, hunted animals, and did not practice agriculture. So agriculture is relatively young. For some parts of the world, a very few, it might be around 10,000 years old. You often will see that agriculture started 10,000 years ago, but that's like only a few kind of counties around the world. Much of the world transitions to agriculture around 5,000 years ago. So if we take our species, anatomically modern humans, and say they're maybe 300,000 years old, I know estimates vary, then you're talking about only at most 3% of our species history has involved cultivation and agriculture. And for most of the world, it's probably half that. So it's 1.5%, 2%. So it's a very recent thing in terms of our human evolutionary history, but it's had a momentous impact. So estimates for the entire global population at the beginning of the Holocene, so 10,000, 11,000 years ago, of course it's difficult to do that, but for the whole Earth, range between 5 and 10 million people. I think Ballari district is what, 14 million? So there's more people in Ballari district today than the entire planet 10,000 years ago. And the reason that's possible is through the origins, development, intensification of agricultural systems, which have allowed us to ramp up food production, to increasing efficiency and to feed more people. So it's had a huge impact on global environments and human populations. So I think that makes it a very interesting and important subject to understand. Now, if we look globally, we know that plants are domesticated in many parts of the world, and there's kind of independent domestication, meaning hunter-gatherers take a local plant, bring it into cultivation, and domesticate it. And that's happened in at least 20 or 24 places. And these are some of them here shown in blue with some of the different crops and different kinds of crops. And I'm not going to go through that. So, and there's still a lot that we're learning about all these different origins. But today what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on this little area down here, South India, in the second part of my talk. In the first part of my talk, I'm going to talk about this area here, what we sometimes call the Fertile Crescent. One of the things about this kind of global picture means that we have different instances, so different cultures, different cultural groups, different environments, where they, in some sense, created a similar solution, if you want to call it that, of domestication and agriculture. So it gives us a chance to look at parallel experimentation, parallel evolution in different settings, which I think is a very interesting thing for research. Okay, now another set of preamble. I'm assuming because you're here in this museum, you kind of know what archaeology is already. It's excavating past human sites and recovering the material remains of past human action, both in terms of transforming their sites and creating artifacts and material culture and art and so forth. Archeobotany is a particular sub-discipline that focuses on the recovery and then the study of plant remains. Now, plant remains are not obvious. Those of you who are excavating will know this. You excavate a site, you'll see a potsherd or a stone tool or a grinding stone. You might see a post hole, which isn't really an object but a feature, and you'll excavate around that. But plant remains are small, usually charred, usually fragile, and we really can't recover them easily with the naked eye or not systematically. And so we do something called flotation. And so I just illustrate some examples here. There's two main systems for flotation. You can either use a machine or you can do bucket flotation. Now, I'm a great advocate for bucket flotation because it's cheap, it's portable, it's flexible. All you need is time and labor and water. And so we have here an example of bucket flotation with Dr. Venkata Subbiah in the Kundru River in Kurnool, maybe 20 years ago or a bit more. This is also bucket flotation at about 2,900 meters in southern Ethiopia in a mountain lake. So you can take a bucket flotation anywhere. If you have fixed facilities and a long-term excavation and you have access to either petrol or electricity, then you can build a flotation machine. So this is an example of a flotation machine being used in the Near East. Flotation machines have the advantage of requiring much less labor. So one person can run a machine, whereas bucket flotation, to be efficient in terms of time, you need lots of workers. Okay, regardless of which method you choose, the idea is you catch a light fraction, stuff that floats on water, it's mixed out of the soil, floats up, and it's caught on fine meshes. My preference would now be for 250 micron or 300 micron mesh, so that's 1/4 millimeter. When we first started working here, we were using 1/2 millimeter, which is okay too, but you miss some of the smaller things if you do that. So this just shows some examples. So we'll be talking about the Near East today. Here's some Imr wheat and Imr wheat chaff. You can see that those are all fine. They're all bigger than 1 millimeter. But things like rice chaff, these things here, you'll lose if you use a 500 micron or a 1/2 millimeter mesh. So that's why I prefer the smaller mesh size. So that's a rice grain, and that's hundreds of rice microbases, which is like gold dust if you're interested in rice domestication. And here's some examples from this region. Lab bean or vare, tuvare, tourdal, pigeon pea in English, and hurale or horse gram. Those are all from Sanganakallu. So these are the kinds of things that we can get out of flotation. Of course, much of what we get out is wood charcoal, so then you have to spend days in the microscope sorting out the seeds, and a lot of it's fragmentary, and then learning to identify them with reference to modern material. Okay, so now let's delve into our Southwest Asian case study. So this just shows us where we're working. So why do we go work in an area? Well, ideally what you do is you go through the botanical literature, regional floras, study of vegetation, studies of crops themselves, and where botanists and geneticists have worked out what are the closest living wild plants related to that species. And that's been done for a long time for, say, Southwest Asia, because that's where some of our Western favorite crops come from, things like wheat and barley. And so we've known since, the first versions of these maps were produced in the early 1960s of the distributions of wild populations of wheat, wild populations of barley, wild pea, wild lentil, wild chickpea. And so this just shows wild barley in the yellow on the top and there's two different kinds of wild wheat here, emmer wheat and einkorn wheat. But you can see that they all sort of overlap, not identical distribution, but they all overlap in what we often call the Fertile Crescent. So with the wild ancestors of wheat and barley grow there today, so it's a good place to look for their domestication. Now, of course, because they grow there today, doesn't necessarily mean they grew there in the past. So some wild populations may have gone extinct because of climate change or habitat destruction by people, and also ranges can shift because of climate change. But they're unlikely to shift from, say, this region to Southeast Asia or China or to South Africa or something. So they might shift around, but they tend to stay within the region. So to preempt something we'll talk about later, one of the reasons we got excited to work in South India was it was clear that there were species native to, that are important in Indian cuisine, like moonbean and harali, which have their wild, and tur dal, which have their wild ancestors, their wild populations in the Indian Peninsula forests. So that meant their origins would be here. Okay, so this is wild wheat and barley. The numbers are just some archaeological sites that we're not going to go into huge detail on individual sites, but sites that have been used for data of tracking domestication in these species. Now that general region, we should also look at it ecologically. So it's, as you come off the Mediterranean, you're in a kind of Mediterranean woodland zone, and as you move towards the center of that Fertile Crescent, it gets increasingly dry. In fact, a lot of sort of eastern Syria or Iraq today is desert, right? And the transition then from the Mediterranean woodland towards the desert goes through a grassland, and you go through more open woodland, what we call parkland, with tall grasses, and then you go to a tall grass steppe, low grasses, and semi-desert and desert. And it's that transitional mosaic between the oak parkland and the grassland where we tend to find the patches of wild wheat and wild barley. So it's this kind of habitat. So this is a photograph taken in Iraqi Kurdistan, what are called the Karadag Mountains. Now you'll see there's not a lot of tall grass here today. That's, of course, today it's heavily grazed by sheep and goat, and so the grass doesn't get as tall. So to understand the ecology, sometimes you need to take bits of this vegetation and fence it off, and then see how the wild cereals do. And there are natural cultural experiments of that sort all over the Middle East where you get police compounds or military bases that are fenced off, don't allow sheep and goat in, and then you end up with wild wheat and barley doing very well inside the fence where they can't get overgrazed. Now this environment is also rich in other wild resources, wild fruits, wild nuts, that's a fig. These are all things I photographed at the same time, wild pistachio, wild fig, wild grapes, wild plums. So there's lots of things for hunter-gatherers to use, in some areas wild almonds. So these are rich environments for resources. Of course, that attracts game animals like gazelle and deer and wild sheep and things like that. So this is a favorable environment for hunter-gatherers, but it also has potential things that people can decide to cultivate. And broadly speaking, this is that kind of belt. Now it's shifted around with climate change, and we can use pollen data and other kinds of paleoenvironmental data to kind of predict how it has shifted through time, and it has shifted in those various models for that. I'm not going to dwell in detail on that. But essentially, in here is desert, transitions to grassland, transitions to woodland, which especially focus on the mountains, and then, that's the kind of Fertile Crescent vegetation. The other thing that's important to note is the rainfall comes in the autumn and the winter, so it has a mild, not cold, not freezing, a mild, wet winter. So the seasonality of agriculture is you plant things in the autumn before the winter rains, you harvest in the spring. That's, of course, very different from what we'll encounter here, where the rainfall is in the summer. Right? the monsoon. So that also means it's difficult to potentially move crops between some of these zones in the past. All these numbers here are archaeological sites now that have good archaeobotanical data. It's from a recent database. I think all of these had at least 300 identified seeds, at least 10 taxa, so something that's statistically robust. So there's a lot of data. We're not going to go through all of it. We're going to kind of summarize some of it. And there's different regions, and then we can start to compare how things are happening in different regions at the same time. Okay, so again, to give you a bit of chronology, if you don't have familiarity with this, this is the kind of archaeological chronology in the middle here. What we in broad terms would call the Epipaleolithic. These are your microlithic using hunter-gatherers. So they would be similar to what you'd be familiar with here in the late Pleistocene. And then you get a transition to what we call the pre-Pottery Neolithic in the early Holocene, so around 9600 BC. And that's because we think these guys are Neolithic and that they start making groundstone axes, right? And we think that this is when cultivation is beginning, and I'll come back to that. And then we have the Pottery Neolithic, which is when they start making pottery. So the one thing to note is that the transition to cultivation and agriculture in this part of the world takes place amongst hunter-gatherers who don't make ceramics yet. Ceramics are a later innovation. And then the pre-Pottery Neolithic is divided into PPNA, PPNB, and people divide that into early, middle, late. So I'll use some of those terms on later graphs. And that just shows you kind of a sense of how climate is changing. That's from the Greenland ice core, which gives you a very general sense of global climate change. So warmer up here, colder in what we call the Younger Dryas, and then warmer again in the early Holocene. Back here is if we went all the way back to 18,000, it'd be much colder still in the Ice Age. Okay. Now a few bits of definitions about how I'm going to use these terms. These often get used interchangeably maybe, but I'm going to try to use them a bit more precisely. So I'm going to use domestication in a biological sense to refer to the non-human organism, the crop in this case. You could also do it for an animal, when it has undergone genetic change that makes it different from its wild ancestor. And those genetic changes result in changes in the form, the morphology, and that tends to give it a different set of adaptations. In the case of crop plants like cereals, so you can think of rice, you can think of wheat, you get changes in that require human harvesting and human planting. So the plants become less reliant on natural cycles and more reliant on human cycles for their reproduction. It affects like when things germinate, are the seeds dormant or not, and also do the seeds fall off the plant naturally. So we're going to be looking at some of those domestication changes, right? So we're going to keep that in a strict sense. A plant is domesticated or not. Then separate from that is cultivation, and cultivation is a human behavior. It's a set of practices. So people cultivate, plants get domesticated, right? And so cultivation means preparing the soil, putting plants in it. Those might be seeds, they might be tubers, looking after those, harvesting them, and then repeating that cycle. Now, these genetic changes of domestication come about as a result of cultivation, but it's not an instant process. So genetic changes have to accumulate. So this is an evolutionary process. So that means there's a period of cultivation where people are carrying out these practices on what we call wild plants, and those plants eventually evolve and adapt to being cultivated. So that means we expect a period of pre-domestication cultivation. Now, we could say it's an open question as to how long that period is. I'll give you some answers in a few minutes. So that's sort of what we're looking for. We want to say, when do people start cultivating? When do we see domestication processes, which are not instantaneous? And therefore, that's a period of pre-domestication cultivation. And then we're going to ask, when does it finish? When are crops kind of domesticated and they're not evolving in the same direction anymore? And when do people finish the transition in economic terms and become agricultural? So cultivation, early cultivation, pre-domestication cultivation, I would say, is always practiced by hunter-gatherers. And at some point, they shift their social system and economy towards being agriculturalists. So that's also a gradual change. So we're kind of looking for three different changes: in the plant, in human practices, and in the greater economic system of the socio-economy. And those don't all happen at once. Okay, so domestication trait one that we're going to look for, and this is particularly for cereals and grasses, that includes rice, it includes millets, sorghum, wheat, and barley, is about seed dispersal. So here at the top, I've got an example of wild barley. When the grains are mature, they each fall off the plant, and they're in this spikelet, which you can kind of see them in my hand here. They're shaped like an arrowhead. They're very well engineered. They're very aerodynamic. You drop them, they always land point down, sharp ends down, and they'll poke their way into the soil. And they're covered with little hair barbs, little silica barbs, unicellular hooks made of glass, all over them, all pointing one direction. So they can only go down into the soil. So these are ones that have fallen overnight onto fresh soil, and then if you leave them there, they will literally drill themselves into the soil. And in fact, they actually move, but they move this long thing, the awn moves, it twists, but it does one rotation every 24 hours. And because doesn't have muscles, it has air vacuoles, but because of the changing air pressure between a hot day and a cold night, the different fibers in there contract and expand at different rates. So it just ratchets, it's like you're screwing a little screw, but you just do one turn every night. It takes a long time, but it gets there in the end. So they're really well engineered for that. Here's domesticated barley. First thing to note is all the grains are still attached. They're all mature. It has a lot less hairs and barbs. It's a lot less aerodynamic. It's all fat. This awn, is much shorter and less hairy and so forth than these. So it loses all of that ability to shed its own seed and work its way into the soil. And it's sitting there, basically waiting for a person to come along and harvest it. And then you harvest the ear, you've got to break it apart to separate the grains. And then process it again to separate the grains from the chaff. And if you're a farmer, you'd harvest the ear, you'd separate the grains through threshing, you'd save some to replant next year. Maybe you save 5% to plant or something, or 10%, and then the rest you would process further to eat, right? And so that means that this plant is now reliant on human labor to harvest, process, and plant. Right? So that's a big deal. The plant doesn't really reproduce itself anymore. It requires people. And that occurs through physical changes in how this ear is struck together, and we can see those. So these are archaeological examples of the rachis that hold the ear together. In the wild type, you have a smooth scar here. It's been broken in each end. The domesticated type, you can see it's ripped here, and you've got the base of the neck segment above, where it's also ripped. So it's been ripped by human action, by threshing. Right? So we can recover those through flotation, and we can say, is it shattering barley, wild type dispersal? Is it domesticated barley? How quickly do those ratios change over time? You can do the same thing for wheat or rice. So this just illustrates the same sort of thing for rice. We're not going to talk about rice today, but here's wild rice. This was stuff we studied with some other colleagues in Orissa a number of years ago. The wild rice spikelets are falling off on my hand as you grab the plant, and they're falling into the mud. Domesticated rice, of course, just gets heavy with all of its grains waiting for the farmer to harvest it. And that again leads to a physical change where the harvest in the spikelet base, where the round, smooth type is wild, the ripped one, it's torn out by human action. Right? So it's the same idea with any crop, really. Okay, then the other thing we'll look at is seed size. In some ways this is easier, we can always measure the size of things. It's also a little bit less clear cut. So seeds tend to get bigger with domestication, they get fatter. But that's a kind of statistical thing. It's not like there's a wild type size and domestic type size. There's a range in both, but the range shifts. And it shifts outside the wild range massively. So that just shows wild rices, wild barley, melon, pea, that's a mung bean down there. These are the domesticated versions, just modern materials. So you see the domesticated ones are fatter. They're not always longer, but they're fatter. That means they have more volume. That means they have more calories. That also means when they're a seedling, when you're planting them in the field, all those calories power the germination and they power the seedling. So that seedling will outcompete smaller seeded seedlings. That's what I would refer to as the level playing field effect. So basically a farmer creates a clean soil and puts seeds in it, and those seeds are all competing with each other. So you're all competing with your cousins. And whoever can get bigger faster has more area to put their roots, which is nutrients and water, more area to put their leaves, which is sunlight. And those larger seeds will produce faster seedlings and therefore compete. So gradually will lead to genetic changes for larger seeds. Okay, but from an archaeological point of view, we can recover our seeds and see how size change happens over time. Oh, this one's out of order, so we'll move that. Okay, so yeah, so we've kind of known this for a while. This is an archaeobotanist named Gordon Hillman, who passed away a few years ago. He used to also be in London. And he did a bunch of experiments in the 1980s on harvesting wild wheat to try to see how quickly it could be domesticated. So here he is with a paddle harvesting wild wheat. If you paddle it, you get the loose stuff, the wild stuff. He also tried with a reconstructed sickle, where you only get the tough types. And he planted wild wheat with the 1% of plants of domesticated wheat. And then he looked at how different harvesting methods affected it. And what he found is that if you harvest with a sickle, mature wheat, then of course it favors the domesticated type, not the wild type. And he used that to estimate that maybe domestication could be really fast, 100 years, maybe even 20 years. And we now think he was wrong in his conclusions, because you'll see the archaeobotany puts it more like 2,000 to 3,000 years. He didn't have the archaeobotanical data at that time to empirically test it, but he had the right idea of setting up experiments to try to think through how the process worked. And the problem that he suffered from was a lack of the empirical data to test this with. So this is a chart of the number of published rakuses of einkorn wheat and barley wheat, cumulative by year of publication. So when he was doing this work in the 1980s, published in the early 1990s, we had one site with several hundred, or a couple of sites with several hundred barley rakuses for one period. So there's no timeline in which to test it. And you can see it's only in the early 2000s where we start to get thousands of wheat and barley rakuses published. Of course, it increased a lot since then. That's true of other crops as well. So at the start of the 2000s, of the 21st century, there were 26 rice spikelet bases from an archaeological site, and it was in Thailand, and the place where it was domesticated. So it's really in the last 20, 25 years that we've really been able to start to do this work. And that's because of increased flotation and increased sampling and study of these kinds of remains. So there's a lot of, I think, excitement in archaeobotany in the 21st century as opposed to what was happening before that. Okay, so where are we in the Near East? So here's a summary of what the Near Eastern data for one of the wheat, einkorn wheat and barley, looked like in 2007 when I published this. And so each of these is a different site, and it's the percentages of wild type in black, domesticated type in the light color. And then you have some that are ambiguous. They could be domesticated, they could be wild, either because they're damaged, or you can't quite tell, for whatever region. So that's a kind of error margin. But you can see when you look at this, the Epipaleolithic, it's basically all wild or indeterminate. There's actually a few domesticated ones out of all of two. That's a discussion for another time. PP&A is still mostly wild, right, or indeterminate. There's just a few up there. Early PP&B, start to get a wad of domesticated there. Middle PP&B, again, a small minority of domesticated. And then the late PP&B, lots of domesticates. So it suggested a gradual change, right? And it was really at this time, there was a scholar based in France, George Wilcox, who had a science paper the previous year, 2006, where he had five or six sites in it, and he said domestication looks really slow. So this was kind of inspired by him putting together a larger data set. The other thing George Wilcox was working on at that same time was measuring grains and saying grains are starting to get big. We're starting to see early cultivation by slight increase in grain size. And this is his own work at a site called Jurfa-Lochmar. So what the top graph shows is Jurfa-Lochmar, early pre-pottery Neolithic A compared to a Chalcolithic site, so a site that's sort of 5,000 BC or something. So this is the early stuff, the later stuff. And then at Jurfa-Lochmar, it has two phases, an early PP&A site, PP&A phase, and a late PP&A phase, so the upper strata and lower strata. And you can see there's already a slight shift between the earlier open circles and the later open circles, and this is barley and wheat. And so he suggested, well, you're starting to get these bigger grains already, and at this point, the rakuses are all wild. So it looks wild in terms of shattering, but the grain size is starting to change. Therefore, he inferred it was under cultivation, selecting for some change in seed size, which is great, but this is kind of a visual qualitative assessment. It's not really quantitative. And so what took off after that was an attempt to do quantitative things, and I'm going to jump forward to 2025 and not do all the steps in between. And this is how we would sort of present the data today. So here we've got two kinds of wheat, emmer and einkorn, red and blue, two different species of wheat, and barley. This is rachis data, where the average percentage non-shattering is the dot, and then it's got an error bar, or standard deviation, and that's based on taking some of those indeterminants in, and then estimating a maximum or minimum error and getting a kind of standard deviation. So we've got some error bars on that. So you can see there's some wild barley use that persists. That's quite interesting in its own way. These are kind of desert edge sites in Jordan mostly. But there's a main trend line for all three cereals for this gradual increase to non-shattering, taking place between sort of 9,000 BC, or just before, and sort of 7,000 BC. So about 2,000 years. That's a lot more than the 20 to 100 years that Gordon Hillman predicted. And this is grain size for the same species, so grain width. I've combined them by turning it into a percentage. So you take the earliest grain width as 0, and you say what percentage increase in the average width. And then you can scale the error bar, the standard deviation in the same way. So we put them on the same graph. So again, we see these trends over time of things getting bigger and then leveling off. If we carried this further, they would stop increasing completely. So emmer seems to start a bit later. Interestingly, emmer starts a bit later here too. Anyways, barley and einkorn are together. But again, from sort of 9,000 BC to 6,500 maybe, things are increasing. So that's 2,500, 3,000 years. Okay? So that's what domestication looks like when we document it. Now these are different sites. I haven't labeled the individual sites, but they're all in that Fertile Crescent in that same time period. So we can see it's a kind of regional picture. Things to note about it. The evolution of these features increases yield. These become easier and easier to harvest, right? The shattering ones, you lose a lot of grain to the soil. The non-shattering ones are easier to retain because it stays on the plant. Therefore, your return of investment for time harvesting is going to increase just because of the genetic change without doing anything. Now, of course, people also always do things, and we'll look at that next. They tinker with their technologies and improve them to make their harvesting even more efficient. So that's going to increase yield per field of cereals. And then the grains, of course, each larger grain that you harvest has more calories in it. So that's also increasing the yield. So both these things are inherently increasing yield as a kind of unintended consequence. So I don't think anybody at 9,000 BC said, gee, wouldn't it be great if our cereals were bigger in 2,000 years and didn't shed their seeds in 2,000 years. No one's planning 2,000 years ahead. So the plants are evolving into the practices of cultivation. People are planting them intentionally. The plants evolve. People get a positive feedback, and then it gives them a return on investment where the genetic changes improve those crops. So it's unintended consequences of a long-term process that we would call unconscious selection. So no one is setting out to domesticate things. Plants evolve into cultivation, and then people, of course, evolve in their cultures in response to that. This just shows we can do that for other species in the Near East. So also domesticated in this area is your gram, your chana, chickpea, we call it in Europe, and flax, also pea and lentil. They all show these size increase trends over the same period, more or less. Now, we can then also ask the question, how does this feed back into human culture? So one thing that might be obvious to look at is tools related to harvesting. And so a number of years ago, we had a visiting scholar, Simon Maida from Japan, who works on Near Eastern lithics. And he was in London for a year, so we set up a project to sort of look at this. And so what he did is he gathered data. He went to all the reports and gathered data from 247 excavated sites in these areas. So these are all the sites. The sickle blade data. He focused on sites with mainly chert lithics, rather than, so if the majority was obsidian, he didn't include it because he wanted only to count things that had sickle polish on one edge, which you can see on chert, to indicate that that tool type was a harvesting tool, and we know from a few preserved examples with bone or wooden handles that they have to be lithic blades, something like that, right? But you can see there's a diversity of shapes. So here's early up to the PP&A, PP&B, and then later PP&B in ceramic Neolithic. So the shapes change through time, and they're regionally different. So we put them into different groups, typological groups. Here are some of those groups, not all of them, so you can see there's quite variation. The thing to note is that some of those groups are really complicated to make. Look at the groups 4, 10, and 7. Lots of fine work making a serrated edge. So each of those blades takes more effort, more steps, a longer chain of paratoire than these simple blades that you have in the earlier phases. And that's a chronological pattern. So what the top chart shows is tells you how many sickles there are. So how many blades, how many of all the lithic are sickle blades? If we go back to before cultivation or early cultivation, this is 10,000 BC, you've got, sickle blades are present, but they're 1 or 2% of your lithic assemblage. But you can see this, they start to increase on most sites up here. So you get sites that have 30 or 40% of all their tools are sickle blades. So people are making a lot of sickle blades and less of other things. You still have some sites that are down here, and that's interesting in certain groups, group 12 down here. So those cultures are less interested in sickle blades. So some cultures go in for it more than others. And the other thing that we did is we ranked the complexity of the sickle tool. So there's 4 grades here, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Basically, as you go up, it's harder to make. It's more specialized. It takes more steps to make each sickle blade. So through time, you get more and more complicated and expensive sickle blades. So more effort, more specialist tool making goes into sickle blades through time. So what those two trends both suggest is that as cereals are undergoing domestication, remember this is when the cereals are becoming non-shattering. As they become non-shattering, sickles are an increasingly more efficient way to harvest them. So people increasingly invest in both more sickles and more complicated sickles. So there's a feedback. So people are making their sickles more efficient too. So it's also a cultural thing in that as you become more invested in farming, you want your farming tools to be better, right? So it's also a kind of cultural investment and a shift away from, say, a hunter-gatherer mentality who's doing some harvesting to a farming mentality. Now, before we move to something, I just want to walk through a little bit of some of the other archaeology just to give you a flavor of it. So we'll kind of do it in a few time steps. So this is your kind of beginnings, what we call incipient pre-domestication cultivation, pre-cultured Neolithic A. The sites with colors on them are ones where we have non-shattering data. So you can see you've got some sites where non-shattering rakuses are appearing, but in very low percentages, less than 28%. This means you have cereals but no rakuses. Other ones may not have rakus data, so we just don't have the data. And then I've also flagged areas where you've got sites that don't have any wheat, but they only have wild barley used. And actually, interestingly, this area has sites like Brucefoot that have no cereals at all. So at the same time period, they're using nutlets and wild foods only. So we're still in the Neolithic culture, in a broader sense, but they're not doing any cultivation. So some guys are cultivating and starting to investigate things. These guys aren't doing anything. These guys, it's unclear. They might be cultivating, they might just be gathering wild barley. In this period, you start to get your first investment in architecture, regardless of which of these zones you're in. So you get things like what are thought to be communal buildings. So these granaries that draw, this is a granary, it's a reconstruction of it, is in the kind of center of a small settlement. It's a kind of public community storage place. You also have in Djurfalakmar, you have these round structures here, which are also thought to be storage buildings. And then next to the storage buildings, you get a multi-room rectangular building, of which this is one room example, which has been labeled the Djurfalakmar kitchen, because it's full of grinding stones and basins for soaking things. Remember, and it's got fireplaces and things. So it's for food preparation and processing, but it also seems to be communal. It's not like you have houses with kitchens. It's a kitchen next to the granary, and all the other little houses don't have kitchen features. So again, there's a kind of community level. And these are very small communities. These are half a hectare. These are small communities of, 40 people or something like that. So there's a lot of pooling of resources. You also have these communal buildings at Brucefoot of unknown purpose. For those of you who follow these things, this is the same period of the famous site of Göbekli Tepe, which is in, if you go back, Göbekli Tepe's up here somewhere. So again, it's where they're making communal buildings for rituals with pillars that are engraved with lizards and birds and foxes and things. Very little, no evidence for cultivation at this site yet. So again, they're kind of hunter-gatherers, but in that early cultivation world where they're investing in community architecture. So in some sense, you could think of early cultivation as a way that some communities invest in communal activities. You cultivate, you harvest, you store it together, you cook it together. Other parts, they're investing in monumentality and other kinds of rituals. That's a kind of, maybe it's an alternative thing. So rather than economic change, it's partly about a kind of community investment in some sense. That's a suggestion. Then if we move to the next page, the early and middle PPMD, we have a lot more sites with evidence for domestication ongoing. We start to get some sites in blue where you have sort of half shattering, non-shattering, so they're midway through domestication. You can, and you can see that you're starting to get these up here in these other areas that were not using cereals at all before. And in terms of architecture, we start to get kind of what you might classically think of a house. So square buildings, some of them multi-room. So these ones at Ashikwi tend to have 3 rooms. These ones at Beda have a long corridor with little side niches, and very thick walls suggest that some of these buildings have a second story. So you're now starting to get individual houses. The other thing is these houses each have a fireplace near the front door, and they often have groundstone tools for processing flour inside. So you kind of cooking by family, by household. That's different from the previous period. So something more like what we might think of as kind of agricultural village living is kind of emerging in this period. And then as we move forward in time to the late pre-pottery Neolithic B, you get kind of more investment in houses and more kind of recognizable house-type features and spread over a much wider area. So here I've shown sites where we have basically fully domesticated cereals, where we have racus data, and there's still some that are still in the process of undergoing domestication in some areas. And you can see they cover a much wider area from Çatalhöyük in the west to Sanganakallu in Iran there. This just shows these multi-room buildings. Here's Sanganakallu in Iran. That's the base of the oven there. And here's a Çatalhöyük house. You've got a platform here. That's where they bury the dead. You have an open fireplace. You have a domed oven. And you have a storage room, storage beds over here in this room. And basically each house is more or less similar. So there's a lot more kind of a patterning of communities in predictable ways. It doesn't mean they're not doing all sorts of interesting things that are fascinating to learn about. And Çatalhöyük is famous for its paintings and its burials and some of its ritual art. So this is Çatalhöyük. I had the opportunity to work on the site for a few years in the last bit, 2012 to 2017. So this just shows, again, one of these houses, and it shows this oven and this open hearth. This then is the storage area, storage room next to it. And this is sampling that oven by one of my former PhD students. The other thing that emerges in this period that we see at Çatalhöyük, but at some sites a little bit earlier, is again another form of investment in kind of agricultural commitment, which in this part of the world means lots of groundstone tools to make flour, and these ovens for baking bread. So essentially these are taboos, the kind of early precursor of the tandoor, for making things like naan or some sort of a bread that you could stick on the inside. And we have charred bread remains in some of these ovens that Laura worked on. So that's again a kind of another doubling down on commitment to cereals. We've been quite interested in this, so this is an attempt to map the archaeological evidence for ovens, variations of this type. Here's one from Jarmo. These, of course, also turn up at Mehrgar. I haven't got the plan, but Mehrgar is full of ovens of this type, and they also occur in southeastern Europe. So as the agriculture based on wheat and barley spreads into southeast Europe, it spreads east through the Iranian plateau to Baluchistan. They take with them it goes with it a whole series of cultural practices like grinding, making flour, building ovens, baking bread. The other thing to note is the early levels of Çatalhöyük, like the early levels of Mehrgar, like Sanghi Shakmak that we looked at here in Iran, they're all pre-ceramics though. They're all a pre-ceramic Neolithic in the first phase. So again, you bake bread before you have cooking pots. So again, there's a kind of commitment to that way of life. Eventually they do develop pottery and diversify their cuisine. But I would also note that that's basically as far as the ovens go in the Neolithic. So east of Balochistan, east of the Indus Valley, you come into a very different world. Of course, the monsoon environment is a different environment. And it takes, I think, several thousand years for the cereals to adapt. And by the time they do adapt to the monsoon, you have to think about the indigenous agricultural developments in the Indian subcontinent that are already taking place. Things like, I meant to put this somebody else, but anyways, things like sheep, goat, and cattle are able to spread more easily than crops. Okay, so what's taking place in the Indian subcontinent? That's where we need to look at our indigenous crops. And one of the ones I'll come back to is this one here. I'll flag it here because I suppose we call it my favorite millet, Brachyuria ramosa. In English, we call it brown top millet. I can't remember what the Canada name is meant to be. Yeah, no, Brachyuria.
Okay, yeah.
I'll look it up for you in a minute. Anyways, yeah, so this just, we'll come back to this, but this shows the archaeological distribution of these. An area of modern cultivation down in Tumkur district and borders of Tamil Nadu. Also, I've now found, after I did this map 10 years ago, in the early 20th century, there was also cultivation up here in the hills above Visca. I don't know if it's still there, but so it does persist, but it's much more important in the ancient day. Ethnographic work in the 1990s shows some of the kind of rotis and puris and even dosas made out of brown top millet and pulse flour locally. Okay. So let's think now about South Asia. You'll probably be more familiar with a lot of this than I am. This is just a kind of simplified way to think about the climate here. Obviously, the summer, these are profiles from January to December of rainfall. So the rainfall is peaking in the middle of the calendar. Of course, in the southeast, you have a winter monsoon. In the Western Ghats, most of the rain falls on the Western Ghats, and you get this rain shadow effect. You get the drier places like the Maidan, places like Ballari district that are much drier. So you have light monsoons. Streams dry up in the dry season as well, so you don't really have perennial rivers. In the north, of course, you have much heavier monsoons, massive perennial rivers like the Ganges. That's, of course, because it's constantly fed by melting glaciers throughout the summer in the Himalayas. And the Indus, of course, is also fed by snow melt and glacial melt in the Himalayas constantly, and you get more kind of light summer rains and less, light winter rains and less summer rains. So we can think of it as kind of three broad zones, and we're going to focus really just on this zone today. Now, this other map is a map of kind of different Neolithic zones in broad terms around India, the Ganges and Saurashtra and Orissa. And we're really only going to focus today on the Ashmand area and the southern part of the broader Deccan zone. So that's sort of what we're going to look at geographically. But if we think about this, we're looking at a semi-arid area that has a light summer monsoon season, relatively light compared to other areas. And that's characterized by what I call, what I've referred to as the savanna corridor in peninsular India, which is shown here. And it's also shown here. This is a broad scale from a global map of vegetation, so missing out things like the Sandur Hills, which have dry deciduous, but essentially the hatched areas are your dry evergreen scrub, that's all your spiny acacias, and grassland habitat. And then the light green are your dry deciduous woodlands. In theory, that's if they're not cut down in agricultural, right, to convert to that. And then your darker greens are into your moist deciduous and your tropical forest in the Western Ghats. So you can see that there's a big savanna belt here, which is similar habitat to Saurashtra and parts of Rajasthan. And that shows it there as well. Then this just shows a distribution of known Neolithic and Chalcolithic sites. And you can see that a lot of them focus on this zone. There's a few outside, but not as many. Now, maybe they're harder to find and there hasn't been much survey work, but maybe it is also the case that in the kind of Neolithic there was a preference for this habitat. And my suggestion would be that one of the things that's good about this habitat is it's great if you're a pastoralist. So if you've got sheep, goat, and cattle, it's very easy to work your way, it's much easier to work your way through these environments. The other key thing is that it's the edges of these environments that are probably the most exciting in terms of plant resources, where you get ecotones and transitions between the kind of dry scrub savanna and the deciduous woodland. And of course, these are in broad terms. You might say, okay, the edges of this. But there's going to be lots of little edges. Anytime you have a hill zone that gets a bit more rainfall, like the Sandor Hills, you're going to have those edge effects of the deciduous forest as well. The other thing that I don't have time to go into is there's some pollen data from Lonar Lake, which is up here in Maharashtra, so it's pretty far away, but it's broadly speaking in the same zone that shows that you get the expansion of savanna starting out 3500 BC. So earlier than that, it's wetter. There were less savanna indicators, less grass, and pockets of savanna, whereas from 3500 BC onwards, this whole grassland area expands. So that's another factor at play. Okay. Now, the reason the edges are interesting is when we look at the modern distribution of wild ancestors of some of the crops that we know come from India, they tend to line up on savanna margin edges. Now, these things have been very poorly studied traditionally. So in the 1980s, 70s, and 80s, there was good work out of ICRISAT, which is in Hyderabad, International Crops Research Institute, and they were working on tur dal, so pigeon pea, and from that you can map the kind of wild pigeon pea. In fact, it's there in some of the colonial period botanists as well. So they're focused today on the Eastern Ghats. So you can see the northern Eastern Ghats from the Orissa through Andhra zone. It may have been somewhat more widespread in the past. The purple is wild populations of horse ground, which I mapped by going to the herbarium in Calcutta, the herbarium in Pune, the Botanical Survey of India, the Kew Gardens of the Natural History Museum in London, which have old collections from India, and trying to figure out where people had collected wild, not cultivated horse ground. So only a few dots, but they all tend to be in the savanna zones, but near these transition areas. So this suggests that this is native to the kind of savannas and its transitions to the others. And then hatched is your wild mung bean and your wild erd bean. So erd bean, both of them focus on the Western Ghats. Erd continuing up through Rajasthan and the Air valleys and Mount Abu. And wild mung bean also reported from parts of the Eastern Ghats. And that's the Satpuras up there. So you can kind of see that, again, they kind of frame, they're kind of on the edges of this savanna belt. So when I first started here, when I first met Ravi in 1996, we didn't have this map, but there were some hints in the botanical literature that we might be thinking about the wild ancestors of some of these pulses being in the Western Ghats and in South Indian forests. And so that was one of the appeals of trying to look for the origins of agriculture here, and this further data sort of vindicates that. This just gives you a sense of some of these landscapes. So this is the Sandor Hills. This is looking down into the kind of savanna zone. So this is this kind of dry deciduous parkland transition type environment. Now, of course, environments today are often massively transformed by agriculture and overgrazing and industrialization and things, but you can still get hints of what these ecologies would have been like. This is wild mung bean here. These guys here popping up here. This is in the Western Ghats, southwest of Pune in Sindhudurg district. But you'll similarly get it all through the Western Ghats and parts of the Eastern Ghats. That's just one of the places I've happened to see it in the field. But other botanists have collected it elsewhere. And then the dry evergreen zone. It looks a bit more like this. So you'll be familiar with these landscapes. And again, when it's not overgrazed, you'll have clumps of grasses. Today, the clumps of grasses will kind of hide under the acacia where the goats can't get them. And we think we might have some wild horse gram in such zones, and we certainly have the wild millets. And again, a nice zone for grazing, moving your herds of animals around to graze them. Take advantage of those plants, even though it's so dry. Okay. So we know, if we come to the Neolithic in this area, as you know from this museum, one of the things that characterizes the Neolithic here are the ash mounds, and I'm sure you're all familiar with those. This is just to flag that up. And of course, the ash mounds on some general level signal that pastoralism and cattle were very culturally and economically important at that time. So these are huge amounts of cattle dung that have been burnt, and they've been burnt to places where cattle have been penned. So that tells us that people are doing a lot of herding cattle. Now, we don't think, not all of us think, many of us think that these are seasonal sites, so people didn't live at the ash mounds year-round, but they gathered there with their herds, maybe different groups, for certain events, certain times of year. It's interesting that these really biggest ones, which are probably these kind of group, kind of accumulated big group herds of different groups coming together, tend to be at the bases of these big hills, which are likely to have springs and water sources in the dry season. And of course, cattle need water in the dry season. So maybe they are a dry season, the kind of peak of the dry season gathering point, April or something like that. So in any case, we already know, and we already knew long ago, in the 1960s already, and certainly by the 70s, that you had these ash mounds that were testaments to cattle herding, cattle pasturing as part of the Neolithic economy, but we had no evidence for what they were doing with plants, what plants they were eating, were they cultivating. So when we started our work together here in 1997, were they cultivating? Probably. What were they cultivating? We don't know. We didn't have the evidence. So that's sort of where the genesis of this project, like we know they have sites, we know they have cattle and sheep and goat. Cattle are important. What plants might be important? And as we started working, it was also evident that many of these sites were under threat and undergoing destruction. And so where we could record stratigraphies and take samples, we could get archaeobotanical data, and we could get data for radiocarbon dating and artifacts to study from these sites before they were completely erased. So I just show here a picture I took on the top of Hiraguda, Area A in 1998. It's stitched together of two, that was pre-digital camera, so it's stitched together of two different pictures that I scanned from slides of it. Here it is here, that's Sanganakallu Hill in the background. Notice this boulder where it's one little boulder on top of another one. That's the same boulder here, not exactly the same angle. That's 2004. You can see this boulder has been completely quarried out. A lot of this is local destruction. See, they just started to dig it up at that point. Some of this is excavation. That's the archaeological work, that section there. That's 2 days ago we went. So that's that same stone there. It's now being protected by acacia and is no longer, so the destruction has been halted in a sense. But it also showed you when we encountered these things, they were already being destroyed within a few years. In many cases, there was a high amount of destruction. So in some sense, we were lucky to get in where we did and be able to start to recover some information from these sites. Things that we found is on these hilltops, you have settlement areas that we regard as villages. So they have thick deposits of midden-type material. But sometimes they also have ash mound material, but buried ash mound material. So we had a buried ash mound at Hiraguda A. This is the 2004, the larger excavation at Sanganakallu, and this ashy material here is an ash mound, which sits on the bedrock. It's a kind of natural bedrock. You've got this ash mound. It's then cut into by later pits. There's lots of later pitting, but it's clear that initially there's an ash mound with occupation around it. Eventually the ash mound is abandoned and the village grows up over the top of it and digs pits into it, things like that. This is a test pitting at Velpumudugu, which is southeast of here, maybe a couple hours drive, 2-3 hours drive from here. Yeah, and a test pit in 1998, which again has buried ash mound material here. The picture's not very good. Again, it's pre-digital camera, and which has some pitting into the top of it, and then some village occupation on top of it. So from all those, we sampled something like 26 sites in a couple of years at that point in time. Not all of them produced archaeobotanical results, stuff we could easily date, but about 14 of them did. And from that, we were able to construct chronologies. Subsequent work building on that project, particularly the Sanganakallu sites, allowed us to build a quite complicated kind of life history of the various sites. So that's summarized here from a paper a few years ago, where we think the hilltops, both at Sanganakallu and Hiraguda, start as kind of ash mounds or cattle pinning sites on the hilltops, and then a buildup of village occupation around it, eventually an abandonment of the ash mound, and then it's covered by a village occupation that it seals those ash mound deposits. And then there's later uses, later pitting, large-scale axe production, and other things going on. And these dates here are all, of course, based on the fact that we have seeds from flotation samples that we can AMS date. Sometimes we use wood charcoal, but we try to use seeds and put into stratigraphic sequences. And I'll come back to that in a minute. So this is a kind of summary of what we did. So these are all the sites we sampled in those early days. The light green ones didn't produce crop evidence. Those were mostly very thin sites, so badly bioturbated, or ash mound sites. Number 6 is the ash mound of Utnur, for example. Not a good place to produce seeds. The blue ones, on the other hand, produced crop evidence. And at that time, when we started in 1997, these were the sites that had some archaeobotanical data in the literature. And booty haul, but no quantified data, just a kind of, yes, there are seeds here at that point. So we were kind of working in terra incognita. This just shows how in habitation sites, you get high seed densities compared to ash mound sites. And some of these, I think this is just Sanganakallu, comparing those later, and that's all the sites of different categories. That's Ravi doing flotation. Okay, and then with the seeds, I had to work on developing identification criteria, especially for the different small millets. I'm not going to bore you with the details of that, and for the various pulses. We lay that out by site, so this is different sites and different sub-phases by site in different presence absence. What you see is, if you look at Brachiomosa, Soteria verticillata, they're basically present on everything, almost every site. And then mung bean is everywhere, horse gum is everywhere. So that's where we came up with this idea, and we'll look quantitatively in a minute. But these are the seeds that dominate. They have high ubiquity and high frequency, and they're everywhere in all phases. So these are our staple foods. We do get seeds that are not of other crops, and we do get seeds that are not native, so wheat and barley. But mostly, if you look at wheat and barley, they're mostly in these sites here. There's a few small present in earlier levels, but they're mostly in later phases. And your African crops, like hyacinth bean, only again in later phases. So we have a package of crops that are native to this peninsula that dominate agriculture throughout. Now, the other thing you'll notice is we're starting in phase 2B, so we don't have the beginnings of 2A or phase 1. So there's still work to be done to do that. The other thing we could do is, as I said, is we could take those seeds and get direct radiocarbon dates. And so this was a graph. The gray is the pre-existing radiocarbon dates, number of dates per site before this work, and then in 2007, those are the new dates we published. So we doubled the total number of radiocarbon dates. Had some sites with large numbers of dates, and of course, AMS dates are more precise because a seed lives for 1 year, and so it's not averaging the life of different trees and different growth rings. And we can do Bayesian modeling, which is very much par for the course in 21st century. Radiocarbon dating, you should be putting things in stratigraphic sequences and doing Bayesian calibration. So we can build up quite elaborate chronologies. This is for Sanganakallu Hill, and that's how we then build those life histories and put those sites together. This just summarizes some of the dated sites and the overall phases as we understand it now. And you'll see there's still relatively few sites in the earlier phases that are well dated. Things like Watgall are not really published, so we don't know too much about them. The other thing to note in this is there's a sense in which the ash mounds start to disappear before the village sites disappear. So these are total numbers of dates. These are the counts of the numbers of dates and the summed probability of their calibrations. So you see the ash mounds are earlier. They kind of peak before 2000 BC, and they kind of decline in the early second millennium. And here they kind of decline after 1750 BC. These are 100-year bends, whatever. Whereas the habitation sites take off after that point. So there is some sense in which ash mounds decline, villages persist, which suggests something about changes in the balance of pastoralism and agriculture. Okay, so let's come back to the crops. I just want to walk you through our native staple crops. These are examples of brown top millet. That's Brachyuria ramosa. Not just from South India, but in later periods you get it in early historic Paitan. That's in Maharashtra, in Sri Lanka. We also have it in Sorath Harappan sites, although they're very small, a bit more on the wild end, like Bagazra, Shikrapur. We also get it a little bit in Orissa. This shows a comparison between the kind of wild type grass, which is everywhere in India, and the domesticated type, which was drawn by this Terry and Jacob from Madras Agricultural University in the 1940s. I only recently found that illustration, but it's a nice little early study of this crop in the modern day. So this just shows them, this is wild, and then it tends to be, so this is Soteria verticillata, this is Soteria verticillata, which tends to accompany Brachyuria. So we get two millets, a big one, a dominant one, which is brown top millet, and a smaller one, kind of small cousin, let's say, which co-occurs with it in most samples, and that's the Verticillata. Those are both wild versions of it that you might find today. And this just shows the proportion. So this is the percentage of Brachyhermosa in different phases of different sites. And this is Ceteria verticillata in the same. So you can see that it tends to be dominated by Brachyhermosa with a small amount of Ceteria verticillata. So I now think of that as a kind of companion crop that goes with it. If we look broader across India, this is the data for Brachyhermosa at the moment. So it's sort of everywhere. Large quantities, where I think it's a staple food, are here in the peninsula and here in Saurashtra. One would like to restudy some of these sites like in Namgaon to see how much there really is there. It is there, but how much, we don't know. And then the smaller quantities in some of these other places where it may be a minor crop or a weed. Okay. The other thing to note when we look at the data as a whole, this is your summary of percentages of millets. These are your pulses. The pulses are dominated by mung bean and horse gram until very late. We get lots of this African lab, a little bit coming in here and lots of it there. It's in the Indocenter Optima. If we look at this bottom graph, this is the wild foods, wild fruits, fruit seeds, and tuber fragments, unidentified, but parenchyma from tubers. A lot of the early stages, they disappear. So we think of these as kind of gathered resources, maybe. Those are disappearing as these things are increasing. Those are wheat and barley. Again, generally more of it in later periods. Let's look a little bit then at the pulses. It just picks out the pulses. Mung bean, horse gram, African lab. Again, large quantities only really at the end. And then pigeon pea is interesting because there aren't ever large quantities, but there's a little bit, and it's native to, say, the northern eastern Ghats, right? So on the back of work done on domestication in the Near East and China and things, it seemed like it was high time to come back to South India a few years ago, back in a metaphorical sense, back to the data from South India and start trying to look for domestication processes. So we've now done that for some of the pulses at least. I'll just show you that here. So this is a comparison of modern horse gram land races, seed lengths, and these are wild ones measured in various herbaria. So that's in terms of grain width. So you can see that there is a distinction. The larger seeds are domesticated. Here's archaeological seed size. And seed size, you can see Hellor, Hall, Sanganakallu, Python, which is really historic, and some other sites are in there. But you can see that on average, the seed sizes are getting bigger through time over the course of the Southern Neolithic. So we see at least part of, or the tail end of the domestication process of size increase in this species. So it's still undergoing domestication during that period, so that means it's cultivated. And then with the pulses, we thought we'd try to do something different. So theoretically, many seeds like beans have a thinning of the seed coat as they get domesticated. And that means they lose, thick seed coats give them dormancy, so they sit in the soil, maybe for years without germinating. Thin seed coats allow them to germinate right away. And this is well documented in things like kinopodiums that were domesticated in the Americas, and did a lot of work on, say, domestication of kinopodium in North America by Bruce Smith and Gail Fritz and others. What they relied on is finding the occasional seed with a broken seed coat that you could measure under the SEM from one or two angles. And of course, in modern seeds, it's very easy. You can section them and compare the differences. So we thought we'd try this with South Indian horse gram, but using high technology that was non-destructive. And this was the idea of Charlene Murphy, who was one of my PhD students and then a postdoc, who kind of came across this thing. And she said, "Have you ever heard of a synchrotron?" And I said, "No." And she said, "Oh, these people stuck rocks in there to look for fossils and things. Do you think we could use this on seeds?" And I sort of looked at the paper on fossil stuff, and I said, maybe we could look inside the seeds at the seed coat. So anyways, we wrote to, this is the UK's national synchrotron, there's one in the UK, but it's partly government funded, so you can apply for research grants, which are not money, they just give you time on the machine. They say, okay, you can have, so we got 2 grants for 48 hours each. We got literally 48 hours, 5 p.m. on Friday till Sunday night. So we had to work all night if we could. And what we do is we take each seed, these are obviously modern ones, these are archaeological ones, and you glue it on the end of a little metal pen. And I'll tell you, you can dissolve that glue later. And then that little single seed is stuck on a little stand here, somewhere in this machine. I'll move that one there. And then you close the door. The door is lead and it's about this thick. It's very high radiation. And it bombards it with essentially really powerful X-rays. And it turns the seed. And you get what's called high-resolution computed tomography, X-ray computed tomography. And you can see us working with it at the time. And then once you have all that data, then you have to image process. So it takes the angular data and turns it into a three-dimensional model of the seed, and then you can slice it. So for any one of those individual seeds, so here is HRTC, this is a slice, you get something like 4,000 thin sections sliced across the seed. But it's all from the X-ray and it's reconstructed. It's a pretty slow process. Each seed sits in the machine for like 45 minutes, and then you have about 2 hours of image processing per thing. So, yeah, so anyways, so we got our first report out a while ago. So we did horsegram. So horsegram is actually the first pulse of any from archaeological stuff to have seed coat thinning measured. So not lentil or chickpea or soybean, horsegram started. Now people are trying to do the other ones. So we started it here in terms of this method, and this is what it looked like. So these are means and ranges of measurements for individual seeds. So there's a huge amount of variation. That's partly because there's natural variation in a seed, depending on where you are, partly because of damage, because of course these are charred specimens. So we're looking at averages, but you can see we've got thick seed coats, medium seed coats, and thin seed coats. And Python, again, is early historic, so it's our kind of later control. Early Halure, later Halure, latest Halure. Right? Hall, we had some that were thinner. I could go back and see whether we would still date that to when we dated it. And then Sanganakallu with these intermediate ones. So as a whole, they suggest a thinning process, and it also suggests a gradual or stepped process of thinning. So it's a gradual evolutionary process. This is the seed size change in the same sites and and many other sites. So they're getting bigger and leveling off. The seed coats are getting thinner. So two domestication traits together evolving. And then we haven't done the seed coat thinning yet. I have now imaged a bunch of mung beans to do the same thing, but I haven't processed the images. And for those, we did them last year in a micro CT scanner, which would be a better way than a synchrotron. After doing the synchrotron, you realize, well, micro CTs, high resolution micro CTs are pretty much just as good for what we need, and they're a little bit easier to access. Anyways, so those processes haven't been done yet. But this just shows the increase in seed size of mung bean through time, and I've included some other sites from further north, like Tulja Pogari and Navdatoli, and then early historic Navassa or whatever. But again, we see that domestication process. So if we put those two data sets together and think in terms of percentage change, this is the percentage increase in the average seed length in horsegram and mung bean over time through the Southern Neolithic. So they're both really evolving, undergoing domestication still. And of course, we don't have the beginnings. We don't have phase one of the Neolithic. So we don't know where they start, but we know they're still being domesticated. Now, if you think back with the Near Eastern crops, domestication and seed size change takes like 2,000 to 3,000 years. So let's say they're finished at 1,000 BC, then you're looking at them starting at 3,000 or 3,500 BC. So I guess, that early cultivation goes back to that period. Because they're being domesticated and getting bigger on average, that means their yield is increasing. We talked about that before. That means they're becoming more and more agriculturally valuable and viable. So the other thing we've tried to do is think about what that means for brown top millet yield. We haven't measured brown top millet yield seeds yet. Actually, we haven't put all the data together. So that's, next time I come back, we'll have the seed size increase in brown top millet. But if we take horsegram and mung bean as a model, so these are the percentages, average percentage increase in these different phases for horsegram and mung bean. Yeah. So mung bean seems to be evolving later, a little bit slower than horsegram. So that's the percentage increase from one period to the next, I should say. And then this is the kind of model yield of brown top millet in kilograms per hectare. Which again just shows that regardless of which model you're looking at something from phase 2 that's yielding 25, 50 kilograms per hectare to something that's 2 to 4 times better by the end of the Neolithic. So that just tells you that as these things are evolving agriculture is becoming more productive per unit area, that means cultures are going to be adapting to that. So if you're shifting away from mobile cattle pastures and investing more in agricultural village life and growing millets and mung beans and things, that's partly because those crops are becoming more and more valuable. And of course, that means they can feed more people, feed more craft production, feed more social specialization. And so I think that, this underpins then a lot of fundamental changes that are likely to be taking place at the end of the Southern Neolithic. So the emergence of iron production and things like that, craft specialists, all of that's probably underpinned by more reliable agricultural productivity. Which is why domestication is not just about the plant, but it's also about thinking about how that impacts the overall economic system and the role it then plays in the social system. So this just sort of summarizes the end of the Southern Neolithic. So we have overlapping domestication episodes for horsegram and mung bean. We also pick up the end of the domestication episode for pigeon pea in this material. That's being started somewhere else for the north, I guess. And then we presume that brown top millet is also undergoing domestication during this period. Watch that space. We'll be testing that hypothesis soon. And this is increased, as I've just said, increasing yield per plant, which means facilitating more population, more sedentism, more specialization on non-agricultural roles, and all of that, which is probably also then sort of undermining the more pastoral mobile element, not completely, but sort of undermining whatever role the ashramans and the cattle played. They're not increasing in productivity, whereas the agriculture is. So there's a kind of negotiation and a trade-off that communities are making. Okay, so we come to the end. So some final thoughts. The take-home message really is that the origins of agriculture was slow. Domestication processes were slow, 2,000 years typically, maybe 3,000 years. And the domestication process and the economic change are happening hand in hand, but not necessarily in the same time scale, right? So that means in Southwest Asia, this is happening in parallel over lots of different communities and slightly different trajectories in different parts of a wider region, which is in some sort of interconnected cultural contact. So there's no real center. There's no like, this community invented farming and it spread from there. Lots of communities are in contact and they're kind of playing and experimenting with this stuff, and stuff is evolving, domestication traits, and people are also presumably then exchanging crop varieties over time. Hunter-gatherer components of the economies persist. We didn't really talk about that in the Near East, but when you look at those sites with domestication ongoing, they still use lots of wild nuts, lots of wild seeds, lots of wild foods alongside early cultivation. So hunted and gathered resources persist for millennia, or centuries at least, alongside early cultivation. And this means, in a way, we need to start asking questions differently. So domestication is not a solution for a problem, right? Domestication is an unintended outcome of practices of management of resources and cultivation, but people are not intending to domesticate plants to solve climate change or to solve population pressure. You'll see that in textbooks, but it doesn't make any sense. You don't say, I'm going to domesticate this in 2,000 years from now so that my descendants in 2,000 years can avoid climate change. Right? So we've had models thrown at us from anthropology textbooks for decades saying, yeah, you have climate change in the Near East, population pressure, and then people domesticate things. You don't plan 2,000 years ago, 2,000 years down the road. So it doesn't really work out. You get these inherent tools of increasing productivity. Domestication increases productivity, so it makes it more attractive. It also increases labor requirements. Because, of course, domesticated things are reliant on humans for storage, for planting, for tending. And we see in things like the Near Eastern sickle investment, people invest more and more labor in making the tools for that process. So you might think in a similar way in South India of how much are people investing in things like grinding stones and grinding surfaces for processing grain. Is that increasing over time? There might also be something in the lithic. So we can start to think about those feedbacks between technological change and technological innovation and the kind of unintended consequences of becoming more agricultural. So in South India, we have 1,000 or 1,500 years of domestication processes that we can document, but they're the second half of those processes. We're missing the first 1,000 or 1,500 years. That still needs to be found. Sedentism is late in South India, so it's happening halfway through the process. The Near East is different, and the sedentism is early. So it's easier to find those sites with the beginning of the process. That doesn't mean they're not out there. That's just a challenge. We need more exploration and more sampling so we can start to find those early phases. And we need more sites sampled so we can start to understand how this kind of diffuse regional process works rather than trying to focus on just one or two sites. Thank you.
Yes, questions are welcome. Yes.
Hello, thank you for that talk. It's much appreciated. I'm just wondering, you talked about sort of the pairing timeframes of the expansion of the savanna corridor and domestication and culture and cultivation. Can you talk of any examples of domestication and cultivation unpaired from that savanna corridor, either before it or after, things like that? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good question. So the question is, to what extent domestication, cultivation is paired with the expansion of the savanna corridor? I mean, I would say we don't know because we don't really have data from exactly that period yet. So most of the data we have, and this is true in Maharashtra as it is in Karnataka, is when we have sedentary village-type settlements. And in here, those are taking off around 2000 BC, maybe slightly earlier, some sites. And in Maharashtra, it's similar. There's a few sites that are late third millennium, Kayatha and so forth. But things like Damabad and Namgo and Malwa, where tradition, those are second millennium. So again, we're picking up a lot. Those sites are easy to see. They've got mounds, and so people have excavated them. The earlier phase, we just haven't sampled it. So we don't really know. So it's kind of hypothetical at this point. So is it the case that as maybe even before the savannas expand, local hunter-gatherers are starting to cultivate things in those clearings? It's possible. We don't know. And is that happening then before the arrival of sheep, goat, and cattle? So we have a reasonable idea of sheep, goat, and cattle. They diffused into Saurashtra in Gujarat starting about 3500 BC, because you get dates of them at Loteshwar and things in that kind of early Chalcolithic, as they call it there. They don't say Neolithic. It goes from Mesolithic to Chalcolithic to Harappan, right? Whatever. But so they have cattle there, again, in a similar kind of semi-arid savanna environment, 3500 to 3000 BC, cattle, sheep, and goat. Those animals are coming from the Near East, so those animals are diffusing. We also don't know if those animals are diffusing with the herders, so herdsmen migrating, it's possible, or whether you have kind of local hunter-gatherer cultivator groups who are adopting them through trade and exchange, or both. Both things can be happening at the same time, right? You have some people who are migrating with their herds, and some people who are, hunter-gatherers trading for herds, so forth. So there's a lot we don't understand. The sites we have down here, like Sanganakallu at 2000 BC, have an integrated agripastoral system, so they're cultivating these crops and they have sheep, goat, and cattle, right? So it may be that those get integrated in some sort of way, and then you start to get sedentism. But at that period, they still have the ash mounds, which seem to be seasonal gathering points, and that implies that some of the population is seasonally mobile with their herds, if not everybody. So we still need to understand how the earlier phase of that works. So yeah, good question, I don't have a clear answer.
Any agri specialists have a question? Thank you, sir. Your presentation was very candid. I am basically a graduate in agricultural science. I was very fascinated. I never heard a archaeobiologist so far in my life. One thing that strikes me was even 10,000 years ago, probably 5,000 to 10,000 years ago, people were depending on grains. I saw a slide where almost 1/4 of the building was for storing the food grains, probably. So vegetarianism probably was there many years ago also.
I don't know. I am trying to look at my agriculture knowledge in a altogether new perspective. I think I will take a little more time to really digest whatever I have heard today. And I can only thank you. I have no questions as of now. Probably I will have more questions as I introspect myself. Thank you.
Yeah, there was no question exactly. He was trying to get your, information and digest it and so on. Okay, I may have a simple question.
Yes.
Marco and Garcia work in Saurashtra gives an earlier date for millet agriculture compared to what we have in southern India. What could be the environmental background, cultural transition from late Mesolithic to early sedentary agriculture way of life?
Yeah, so this work that's been done in Saurashtra. So Loteshwar and Vavor, Tembo. Yes, and they also have ground top millet, so that's important. It's not clear that that's domesticated, but they're using it early on. And that's like 3,500 BC. They also there have little millet, so Indian little millet, Panicum sumatrens, which interestingly we don't really have. We get it at Halur, but not at the beginning. I think only Halur has it towards the end, so it's something that's adopted here. At the moment, I tend to see these things as kind of parallel processes, like you have in the Fertocracy in different groups doing similar things in a similar environment, maybe in cultural contact, but we don't really know. So you could also imagine that maybe the millet starts to be cultivated in Saurashtra and it spreads with sheep, goat, and cattle down here. But it's not fully domesticated yet, so then the domestication is local. That's possible. But it's equally possible that you have this kind of broader savanna belt of cultures where they're experimenting in similar ways, and they may share cultural communication and things. We really need more data. So, their sample size is very small in Saurashtra. I think they'll have one really early site. And the other sites within Harappan period, 3rd millennium BC, where you do have ground top millet and lots of panicum, little panicum, which we don't have, and then the Ceterius. They don't see, in Saurashtra, they don't seem to have any horse gram early or mung bean, which we have. And at Rojdi, for example, they get Urd bean. So I think Urd bean comes from Saurashtra, whereas mung bean comes from the south. So there's these interesting kind of mosaic patterns, which again, like the Near East, you get different crops in slightly different regions of the Near East. So we kind of need to see them as somehow interrelated, say, set of cultural phenomena, maybe.
Yeah, another question is about Jebu in southern India.
Oh, yeah.
Whether it is introduced or local, because there are claims that there were 3 centers of domestication in Indian subcontinent.
Yeah.
Southern India happens to be one, but we have not seen this transition from wild to domesticated morphology in the cattle. We understand sheep and goat were introduced, but we are not very clear as yet whether the cattle was indigenously domesticated or introduced along with sheep and goat.
Yeah. So that's an important question about the origins of Indian cattle, zebu cattle, those indicas, which we know very clearly is different from West Asian cattle, which are both Taurus, genetically very different. The genomic data in zebu could indicate multiple domestications, but I would worry that those same kind of data can also be interpreted as introgression processes. So if you have domesticated zebu, which we think they're domesticated, say, in Mergar or Baluchistan, right? And then they're introduced into an area, people can then allow them to interbreed and capture the young from these meetings with the wild, and that will then capture some of that genetic diversity. So at the very least, that's happening, right? So if domesticated zebu come in, that may then be the focus of recruiting genetic diversity from the local wild populations. And we see that with taurine cattle when they spread into Africa, into the Sahara. And you see it with chickens. So chickens come from Southeast Asia, but they have introgression from the gray jungle fowl, which is in South Asia, right? So some genes are coming from the gray jungle fowl, like the yellow feet. Anyway, so it's clear that those kinds of introgression processes happen in animals. It's hard to tease apart. I would tend to think introgression is more likely because we don't have a long sequence of change in cattle, but maybe that's there to be found. So, yeah.
Yes. We have an online question for you from Mr. P.J. Cherian. What do you think about the signature of plant domestication on the Western Ghats side of the Western Ghats of South India in the Neolithic phase? This question is in the background of identifying the region as an archipelago of rainforests consisting of 51,000 islands, circa 3,000 years BP, with close proximity to the Indian Ocean. The known archaeological evidence of this region in the Neolithic phase for habitation is very sketchy.
Is it written down? It might be easier if I read that. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, okay, thank you, Dr. Cherian, for that question. I mean, that's a very good question. And this is about what's happening on the western side of the Western Ghats, so the slopes, or to the rainforest, and I guess the coastal plain. And the short answer is already implicit in the question is we don't really know. I don't think we have any Neolithic phase as such, as we would classically recognize it in that region. I would tend to think that it's such a rich environment, hunting and gathering is going to persist longer because it's a rich environment in terms of wild resources, so there's less sort of need for agriculture. So there's maybe less need for agriculture because it's a rich tropical environment, so that could be one thing to consider. And when we do, I suppose in the Iron Age, we would say first millennium BC or something, you get megaliths, you get, at that point you probably have rice cultivation. You may also have tuber cultivation, so things like taro and yams could be introduced as cultivars, or they could be locally brought from the forest into cultivation. We simply don't know. So, I mean, I think there's a lot of interesting work to be done there. Of course, the Western Ghats is also home to wild populations of turmeric and cardamom and black pepper and lots of other plants that are culturally and economically very important. And we don't know really anything about their prehistory of use, whether people are starting to transplant them early. Yeah, it's a very good question, and I would encourage Indian students and colleagues to consider doing research there, because we need to find the sites and start to research this.
Any more questions? So that was a really wonderful session. Though I was just sitting there and, monitoring the live, streaming, I was not able to really be focused on the topic. I really understand that it was a wonderful program. I'll go back home and I'll have a look at it. I'll listen to that. But then it's always better that you sit here and watch. It's much more better than, going online. So I really thank Professor Dorian Fuller for the wonderful evening today. I think, he has enriched a lot about the plant domestication during the Neolithic times. So Dorian, as you all know, you may not be knowing, he was the first person I met about 24 years ago, before Professor Korishttar. I heard about the Sanganakallu excavations by the Cambridge University and Karnataka University. There's a joint project. That was in 2001. And I came to know that these people, the archaeologists, were there in Ashoka Comfort's hotel. I just straight away went to his room and I told him, I'm Santosh Martin, I'm interested in archaeology. He had his bed and all packets and packets of, mud, just mud, that's all. It was not even sieved properly. So I asked him what it is. He told, he introduced himself. He told that he's an Archeobotanist and, he works with the charred grains. And then he put me on to Professor Korishttar, and henceforth we were very close friends. And he's of course my guru.
And it was really a wonderful meeting Dorian after 24 years. And this session has really enlightened all of us. And yesterday's session, day before yesterday's session by Roman Cunningham, we've had almost 1,800 views. So that is the best part of live streaming. So I'm hoping that this live session also will reach many people, and especially I'm getting a lot of friends requests on the Facebook from mainly archaeologists across the country, across the world. So that's a wonderful thing. I think this is the best part of the museum. This museum is trying to reach out to the world. And I really thank Dorian Fuller, Professor Korishttar, and all of you for having come here and made this evening a wonderful evening. Thank you. So we'll have tea, and then are you all hungry? You can, yeah. We will just take another 5 minutes for tea. So in the meantime, you can have an interactive session with Doreen.